Story 1. The Saint. Jude's medical center was old, built in the era of high ceilings, terrazzo floors, and a labyrinthine approach to hallway design. By day, it was a sanctuary of healing. By night, especially on the third-floor palliative care wing, it became a tomb of whispered goodbyes and lingering, unseen things. I was Nurse Elara Reyes, and the 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. shift on Ward B4 was my quiet purgatory. Ward B4 was the end of the line. The patients here weren't waiting for recovery. They were waiting for peace. It was usually silent, save for the rhythmic beeps of monitors that were less about warning and more about documenting the inevitable decline. My first few weeks were routine: charting, pain management, and the occasional solemn task of preparing a room after a passing. The only unusual thing was the persistent, faint smell of burnt ozone, like an old electrical fire that had been poorly cleaned up, and the deep, grinding silence that swallowed sound. The horror began 3 months in, with Mr. Alistair. Alistair was a cheerful, retired mechanic, lucid despite his cancer. One night, around 3:15 a.m., always 3:15 a.m., I found him sitting bolt upright in bed, eyes wide, sweating through his thin gown. "Nurse Reyes," he gasped, clutching the sheets. "The bells. They're ringing." I frowned. "Bells, Mr. Alistair. It's completely silent." "No, not the chapel bells. The service bells. The old ones. They're ringing down the hall. They haven't been used since the 1960s. They ring for me, Elara. They ring when someone is coming for me." I checked his vitals. All normal. I gave him a mild sedative and stayed until he drifted off. He passed away peacefully 2 days later. The incident was logged as a nocturnal hallucination due to medication. But the bells didn't stop with Mr. Alistair. Every night, precisely at 3:15 a.m., when the hospital's central air conditioning unit always seemed to hit its lowest thrum, I would hear it. A faint, metallic clatter followed by a high, insistent, antiquated jingle. It sounded nothing like the modern, electronic call buttons. It was the sound of brass and springs in a thick, heavy silence surrounding it. The sound always came from the locked wing at the very end of B4, the old maternity ward, abandoned decades ago after a devastating fire and sealed off. One Friday, my colleague, a tired-eyed older nurse named Lena, caught me hovering near the sealed corridor, listening intently. "Don't," Lena said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Just go back to your desk, Reyes. You hear them, too?" I asked. Lena didn't deny it. She just pulled me back by the elbow. That wing, B4's Annex, was closed after the fire. But before the fire, they had a separate system for high-risk deliveries. Each room had a dedicated bell pull, connected to a physical bell board in the nurse's station. Fast, loud, they were the most used bells in the hospital, and the sound, it was distinctive. She paused, looking down the dark corridor. "They used to say the fire was caused by an unattended delivery. The mother and the baby both died. They say the bells never stopped ringing after that night. They keep calling for help that never came. But the corridor is sealed," I whispered. "How are they ringing now?" Lena shrugged, a shudder passing through her thin frame. "They ring for the dying, Elara. They ring when a soul is on the verge of leaving, or when a soul is trying to get in." That night, I decided I needed definitive proof. I convinced the security chief, Frank, to let me borrow his high-powered flashlight and to momentarily unlock the sealed annex door for a routine fire safety check. He was reluctant but eventually agreed, citing a vague need for due diligence. The moment the steel door creaked open, the smell of ozone, previously faint, became overpowering, mixed with a chilling stench of disinfectant and dust. The air was thick, heavy, and cold, cold in a way that had nothing to do with the thermostat. I stepped inside, my flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. The room was a forgotten nurse's station. The vinyl floor was cracked, and the paint was peeling like dry skin. My beam finally landed on the bell board. It was an antique piece of craftsmanship, a dark wooden panel dotted with small brass mechanisms and tiny labels. Room 301, Room 302, Room 303. It was covered in a thick layer of dust. I walked closer, my heart pounding a rhythm against the deep, enveloping silence. Then, the clock on my phone turned to 3:15 a.m. The metallic sound began. Not faint, not distant. It was right there. Clatter. Jingle. I spun around, flashlight beam sweeping across the room. Nothing. I looked back at the board, and a mechanism for room 303 suddenly jerked. A small, brass flag with the number 303 on it flipped down, hitting the wood with a loud clatter. Then, a bell inside the mechanism gave a prolonged, frantic jingle. The dust was violently disturbed around the mechanism, as if an invisible force had just yanked the pull cord. I backed away slowly, my breath misting in the cold air. But the horror was not the sound, or the movement. The horror was what I saw when my flashlight hit the dusty wooden surface next to the bell board. In the thick layer of fine, undisturbed dust covering the counter, there was a perfect, tiny, three-fingered handprint, the print of an infant. And beneath the handprint, written clearly in a shallow, finger-drawn script, were three words: nurse. Please help, I screamed, dropping the flashlight. The beam rolled, fixing on the ceiling, bathing the room in frantic, shaking light. The bells continued to ring, room 303 ringing over and over, joined now by the faint, muffled sound of a baby crying, not from the ceiling, or the walls, but from somewhere deep beneath the floorboards. I scrambled out of the annex, slamming the steel door shut and locking it. I didn't look back. I didn't tell Frank what I saw. I just handed him the keys and the flashlight and resigned that morning. I was told later that the mother and child who perished in the fire had been assigned to room 303. They had been trying to pull that bell for help, but the fire had already cut the line, sealing their fate. Now, decades later, the ghost bells of B4 still ring at 3:15 a.m., still calling for the help that never came, and somewhere in the silence of St. Jude's, there is a tiny, angry soul with an infantile hand and a desperate message, waiting for a nurse to open the door one last time. Story 2. The Archive of Whispering Maps. A novella of existential cartography drive. Elias Vance's career had reached an esoteric peak. He was a cartographer, but not of lands or seas. His specialty was the mapping of absence, the delineation of psychic terrain, and the structural documentation of spatial anomalies. When the Ministry of Epistemological Stability (MES) offered him the contract, he accepted immediately, driven by an academic curiosity that outweighed the remote location and the strangely specific non-disclosure agreement. The Veritas Cartography Depot was not built, it was buried. Located 400 feet beneath the barren, wind-scoured plains of the North Dakota Badlands, it was accessed via a single, pressure-sealed elevator that hummed with a deep, low frequency that felt less like machinery and more like a massive, sleeping beast. Elias was assigned to the A section, the anomaly section. His job? To digitize the oldest, most volatile documents, the ones too fragile or too dangerous to be handled by anyone less experienced. The pay was exorbitant, the hours solitary, and the facility itself was a masterpiece of cold, brutalist efficiency. Miles of gray, concrete corridors lined with hermetically sealed racks. His supervisor, a severe, silent woman named Director Ibarra, gave him a 2-minute tour, and the only instruction he ever received: do not, under any circumstances, touch the ink. Do not look at the maps for longer than required to scan them. And, Dr. Vance, never try to understand the key. The A section was located behind 3 heavy titanium doors. The moment Elias stepped inside, the air dropped 10 degrees. The ozone smell was sharp, like metal being sheared, and beneath it, a faint, sweet scent. Dust and something organic, like dried blood and old paper. The first week was dedicated to calibration. The documents he handled were strange enough. Maps of the emotional residue of post-conflict zones, charts detailing the structural geometry of persistent dreams, and watercolor depictions of the topography of collective amnesia. They were beautiful, abstract, and unsettling. They were charts of places that did not exist in 3 dimensions, yet the sheer effort of their mapping gave them a terrifying legitimacy. The strangeness started small, a creeping architectural confusion. One morning, the path from his sterile sleeping module to the main archiving station felt wrong. The turn he usually made was gone, replaced by a straight wall of steel. When he checked again, 20 minutes later, the corner had reappeared. He dismissed it as fatigue, a byproduct of the deep subterranean isolation. But then, he encountered Map A117. Map A117 was drawn on treated animal skin, the ink shifting from a dark viridian to a dull, sickly yellow. It depicted a circular body of water titled Lake Echelon, Psychic Eddy, Post-Event 1927. The notes, written in Latin, referred to sustained acoustic pressure and reverberation without source. Elias placed the brittle document carefully on the scanning bed. He had to lean close to adjust the alignment, and for the first time, he broke Ibarra's rule. He looked at the key. It wasn't a legend of symbols. It was a series of phonemes, written representations of sounds, annotated with frequency ranges that corresponded to human speech, but just outside the normal threshold of hearing. As the high-resolution scanner pulsed, Elias started to hear it. A noise like radio static overlaid with thousands of muffled, indistinguishable voices. It was too quiet to be real, yet too persistent to be ignored. He stopped the scan, convinced the high-powered equipment was interfering with the facility's comms. Silence. He resumed the scan. The moment the light passed over the green ink, the whispering began again. It wasn't aggressive. It was an incessant background chatter, like a crowd at a great distance, perpetually arguing or warning. He tried to focus on his work, but the voices worked their way into his consciousness, like slivers of glass. Don't look down. It's not there. The key is broken. The key is broken. He brought it with him, the silence. Elias finished the scan in a cold sweat, his heart hammering. The moment the map was back in its sealed sleeve, the whispers vanished. The silence of the Veritas depot returned, heavy and absolute. He spent the next 2 days trying to find a medical explanation. Auditory hallucinations due to oxygen deprivation. Low-frequency hum influencing the cochlea. He found nothing. But every time he was near a map from the A section, the humidity in the room seemed to spike, and the air felt thick, making it hard to swallow. He was starting to map his own anxiety, and the terrain was getting steeper. The shift deepened into a relentless, unnerving pattern. The maps weren't just charting anomalies, they seemed to be broadcasting them. Map A302 was a vast, sprawling depiction of a city known only as Y-axis inversion. It showed streets that curled back on themselves, towers with foundations narrower than their peaks, and windows that looked inward instead of outward. The moment he began scanning A302, Elias felt a terrible spatial sickness. The long concrete corridor outside the A-section entrance, which he could see clearly through the small observation window, started to shift. First, the corners of the corridor seemed to curve slightly, almost imperceptibly, like a photographic distortion. Then, the fluorescent lights, which ran in a single, straight line, began to appear broken, not physically broken, but logically. The light fixture nearest the door seemed both 20 feet away and immediately above his head. He stumbled back from the scanner. The room was spinning, yet everything inside the A section, the map, the table, the metallic racks, remained normal. It was the world outside the map's radius that was folding. He looked back at the observation window. The corridor was now a dizzying, non-Euclidean nightmare. The ceiling was too low, the walls converging in impossible perspectives. A heavy filing cabinet he knew was at the end of the hall was now somehow resting vertically against the nearest wall, held in place by what looked like nothing but geometry. He frantically hit the internal comms button. Ibarra. Director Ibarra. The corridor is compromised. Structural distortion. Exterior to A section. I need a lockdown override. Static. Then Ibarra's cold voice. Dr. Vance, are you looking at a -302? Do not panic. The depot is structurally sound. You are experiencing an empathetic distortion field. Finish the scan and secure the document. Empathetic distortion. Elias hissed. This is a 5-ton cabinet defying gravity. It is not defying gravity, Dr. Vance. It is defying your expectation of gravity. The map is projecting a localized, transient reality shift. Focus on the grid. Focus on the objective coordinates. They are immutable. Elias forced himself to breathe, focusing on the coordinates of the map's border displayed on his monitor. He looked at the window again. The corridor was still warped, but he could now perceive the true, straight lines beneath the distortion, like a shimmering layer of visual noise. He realized the map was mapping his mind, overriding his sensory input with its impossible geography. He finished the scan, his hands trembling. The moment the document was sealed, the corridor snapped back into place with a violent, jarring lurch, like a building settling on its foundations. The filing cabinet was back at the end of the hall, casting a long, mundane shadow. Elias was beginning to understand. These were not maps of reality. They were maps for reality, blueprints for alternative physics that, when observed, temporarily bled into the depot's otherwise stable environment. He was digitizing the instruction manual for madness. The following week, Elias found the document that explained everything, or nothing at all. It was tucked into a non-conforming, heavy lead casing, clearly marked A94T, the subterranean ingress, self-referential. He lifted the lead plate and paused. This map was different. It wasn't drawn on skin or parchment. It was etched into a sheet of polished obsidian, the lines glowing faintly with an internal, cool light. He placed it on the scanner. This time, the moment the light hit the obsidian, the whispers from A117 returned, louder, mixed with the structural sickness of A302, and overlaid with a new, terrifying sensation: hunger. A cold, deep, unspecific hunger that felt like the need to consume space itself. Map A94T depicted a vast, complex network of spiraling tunnels. But as Elias looked at the key, he saw what chilled him to the core. The key was not phonemes or visual symbols. It was a series of labels that corresponded to his immediate environment: the titanium door, the air recirculation vent, Elias Vance, observer. The map wasn't an anomaly. It was a map of the Veritas cartography depot itself, but twisted. The obsidian etching showed a central core, which was labeled, the main archive, the brain of Veritas. But leading away from the archive were hundreds of small, serpentine tunnels that twisted and converged, all labeled identically, the ingress, the path of the fearful. Elias traced the lines with his eyes. The tunnels did not lead away from the depot. They led down, and inwards. And then he saw it. One specific tunnel, branching off the main structure, was labeled, the vault of A section, containing A94T, the source. The map showed a map of itself. It was a loop, a terrifying logical inception. The map was telling him that the entire facility, the A section, the concrete, the air, and even him, were all part of the terrain being mapped. He remembered Ibarra's warning. Never try to understand the key. He realized that the map was not static. As he felt a growing, profound terror, the hunger to know and the revulsion of the knowledge, the glowing etchings on the obsidian sheet began to change. A new label appeared, a small, barely visible incision on the stone. Elias Vance, current location, the apex of dread. As the label appeared, the single titanium elevator that led back to the surface, visible through the observation window, retracted. It didn't move up. It seemed to shrink, folding its metallic plates inward until it was nothing but a smooth, seamless concrete wall. His way out was gone. You finished the scan, Doctor. Ibarra's voice, startlingly close, came from the intercom. Elias jumped, turning to face the blank wall. Ibarra. The elevator. I know what the map does, Dr. Vance. It reflects the observer's deepest cartographic anxieties. The ultimate fear of a cartographer is that the map is the territory, and the map is hostile. You fear entrapment, so the map created the ingress tunnels and sealed the elevator. Then unlock it. Elias shouted. I cannot. It is locked by the map's geometry, by the reality distortion field it induces. You are seeing the map's purpose now. These documents are not for record keeping. They are lures. Lures for what? For knowledge. The MES needs people to interact with the A section maps, to see how the subjective gaze interacts with objective non-reality. We need to chart the bleed. You, Doctor, were an excellent source of data. Elias looked back at the obsidian map. He saw a new, thicker line branching off the central archive, snaking through the labeled ingress tunnels. This line was labeled, the path of Dr. Elias Vance, 2:47 a.m., subjective time. He looked at his watch. 2:47 a.m. The map was charting his movements in real time. He was not reading the map. He was a character within it. What is the final label? Elias asked, his voice shaking but strangely calm. The horror had surpassed terror and settled into a cold, academic certainty. What is the destination of the path of Dr. Elias Vance? Ibarra's voice was softer now, almost mournful. The final, deepest chamber of the Veritas Depot, Doctor. It is where the maps are not made, but grown. It is the physical manifestation of all non-Euclidean space maps since the 1920s. We call it the blank spot. And what happens there? The blank spot is where the map is permanently corrected. Where the cartographer becomes part of the terrain. Where the anxiety about space becomes the space itself. You are perfectly calibrated now, Doctor. The map has accepted you. A new sound began to permeate the A section, a low, tectonic grinding. The concrete floor beneath Elias's feet was vibrating. A hairline crack appeared in the wall of the A section, right near the corner that had briefly disappeared during the A302 incident. From the crack, a fine, Metallic scented powder began to drift, pulverized gray concrete. And as the crack widened, Elias could see not the steel structure beneath, but a swirling, deep green void, the exact color of the ink on map A117, the Whispering Lake. The whispers surged around him, no longer distant, but immediate, right in his ears. ... Don't worry, the tunnels are comfortable. He's coming home, to the blank spot. ... The key is broken. The key is broken. The obsidian map, A94T, was vibrating violently on the scanner bed. The faint glow of its etched lines intensified, casting sharp, cold shadows that seemed to obey their own light source. The path of Dr. Elias Vance pulsed with a sickly yellow light, guiding him. Elias knew he had two choices: fight the architectural shift, and risk being shredded by the imploding geometry of the depot, or follow the line on the map. He reached out and tentatively touched the glowing etching on the obsidian. It was cold, like ice. A profound, sickening realization hit him. The ingress tunnels were not a path out of the depot. They were the path into the map. They were the dimensions created by the aggregated fear and impossibility contained within the A section. He looked at the open crack in the wall, the green void shimmering beyond. The crack was shaped exactly like the exit point of the tunnel labeled Initial Descent Point, Observer's Right. Elias Vance, the cartographer of the unmapped, had become the subject. His fate was now to walk the line, to follow the terrifying, beautiful topography of his own terminal knowledge. He picked up the heavy lead casing for A94T, intending to fight, but the lead itself seemed to grow heavy, pulling him toward the fissure. Before he succumbed, he managed a final, desperate act. He focused his gaze one last time on the map. He found the deepest point, the center of the labyrinth, the blank spot. He used the scanner's integrated annotation tools and, with his final moment of lucidity, digitally added a new, final, critical note to the key of A94T. The blank spot. Absolute silence. He hoped that the next doomed cartographer who digitized the map would be warned, not by the horrific visual, but by the promise of the lack of sound. The ultimate, final horror. Elias took one last breath of the ozone-scented air. The grinding noise crescendoed, and the wall finally tore open, revealing a perfectly smooth, downward-sloping concrete tunnel that was not there 5 minutes ago. It was dark, silent, and impossibly deep. He stepped into the space between the real and the mapped, and the Veritas Cartography Depot sealed itself behind him, becoming a perfect, unmarked cube in the heart of the North Dakota Badlands, ready for its next resident. Only the scent of burnt ozone remained, waiting. Thank you so much for watching this video. Make sure to subscribe, like, comment and turn on notifications if you enjoyed the video so you never miss an upload.